They gave me a plastic plate, laughing as they said, "Fine for old hands." I served myself on silver. I remember that moment with the same clarity that people remember the sound of glass, breaking in the middle of the night, sudden and cutting, a sound that tells you something has been damaged even before you see the shards. I was 82 years old, standing at the table in the common dining hall of the place my daughter insisted was best for me, surrounded by my grandchildren who were too busy scrolling through their phones to notice anything real, and the joke, "Why si main expirag?" delivered with that particular lightness that hides something darker underneath, fell from my daughter's lips as if it were an act of kindness. She held out the flimsy plate, brittle plastic pretending to be porcelain, and she pressed it into my hands with a smile that I know was for the others, not for me, because in her eyes there was no affection, only the certainty of someone who has decided what you are allowed to carry, what you are allowed to hold, what you are allowed to be. I took the plate, because in families you learn to take what is handed to you even when it tastes like insult. But inside me something shifted, like an old lock turning, a reminder that I was not always a woman who lived by other people's convenience. I am 82, yes, and my hands tremble sometimes when I carry a pot of boiling water, but these are the same hands that kneaded bread for 50 years, that tied shoelaces, that stitched clothes by candlelight when money was short, that pressed against the chest of a husband who died too early while I tried to hold him here a few moments longer. These hands carried lives, and yet in that dining hall they decided my skin was too thin for porcelain, my wrists too fragile for weight, and they laughed as though the decision was funny, a harmless family joke. But when you are the one holding the plastic, you hear the laugh differently. You hear it as the sound of dismissal, of being moved from one category to another, from guest to burden, from woman to relic. I live now in a retirement complex that was never my choice, a place with beige corridors and cheerful bulletin boards advertising chair yoga and card games, a place where the walls are washed in the same neutral cream so that no one can complain about colors clashing with their mood, a place where silence is filled with televisions tuned to news channels no one listens to, and the meals are served at precise times as if hunger operates on schedule. My daughter said it was for my safety after I slipped in the kitchen last winter, but what she meant was that it was for her peace of mind, so she could visit once a week and tell her friends she was a good daughter because she checked on her mother. I agreed, or at least I didn't resist, because when you are pushed towards something at my age, resistance looks like stubbornness, and stubbornness is the last dignity they will let you keep before they take away even that. I used to live in my own small house with a garden that smelled of rosemary in the evenings, a place where I could still decide whether to eat breakfast at 6 or at 10, where my books lined the shelves in the order I preferred, where the pictures of my late husband smiled down at me from the mantel. I sold that house under pressure, though they called it advice, and they used the word sensible, as though sensibility were more important than belonging. The money was folded neatly into accounts my daughter manages now, and I am given small allowances like a schoolgirl with pocket change. I am not destitute, but I have been made dependent, and there is a difference between the two that no one seems willing to acknowledge. Dependency is not about what you have, but about what you are allowed to reach for without permission. That day with the plastic plate, it was a birthday celebration, though not mine. It was for one of the younger grandchildren, and the cake was ordered from a bakery that prides itself on fondant decorations and Instagram photographs. My contribution was not required, though I had once been the woman whose cakes were demanded at every gathering, who knew exactly how to fold egg whites into chocolate so that the sponge rose proud and light. I had suggested baking something, even just cookies, but my daughter brushed it aside with the tired patience of hers, the patience that sounds like kindness but is really dismissal in disguise. "Mom, just relax. We'll handle everything," she said. And so I sat quietly, watching as they arranged paper cups and plastic forks and disposable napkins with patterns of balloons. I didn't belong in the preparation anymore. I was expected to sit, to smile, to be grateful for inclusion. When they placed that plate in my hands, laughing, I felt a strange clarity. It was not the first insult, nor the worst, but it was the one that crystallized all the others. I remembered the times they spoke over me when decisions were made about my health, about my money, about where I would live. I remembered being told gently, "Don't worry, we'll take care of it," as if care were the same as control. I remembered how, when I gave away my dining table, the one where we had celebrated countless holidays, my daughter said, "It's too big for you now," as though furniture measured the size of a person's life. Each moment by itself was survivable, but together they built a wall around me, brick by brick, until I was no longer standing in my own home, but in a waiting room for the end. I did not cry that evening. I did not protest. I did not throw the plate back onto the table and demand respect. No, I held it with steady fingers. I filled it with food I could hardly taste, and I sat among them with a smile so convincing that perhaps even they believed it. But later, when I returned to my room, I opened the small drawer where I had hidden a single piece of silver from my old set, a dessert spoon engraved with the faint initials of my husband and me, a piece of metal that had survived decades of moves, and meals and quarrels and reconciliations. I took that spoon in my hand, and I ate the leftover cake directly from its box, not because the cake was good, but because the spoon reminded me of who I had been and who I still was beneath their laughter. That is when I whispered to myself, "They gave me plastic, but I served myself on silver." It was not a rebellion anyone saw, not a protest anyone would applaud, but it was mine. In that moment I belonged not to their judgment, but to my own memory, to the woman who once commanded her own table, who once hosted dinners where people leaned in to listen to her stories, who once chose the plates, the glasses, the seating, and the music. They may think I am too old to choose now, but they are wrong. They are wrong because even if my hands shake, my choices are still mine. And so here I am, 82, speaking to you as a woman who has been dismissed but not destroyed, reduced but not erased. I live alone among many, in a place that calls itself a community, but feels more like a holding pen, and I carry in my drawer one piece of silver that I will never surrender. Because sometimes survival is not about fighting loudly. Sometimes it is about eating quietly with dignity when no one is watching. And if you ask me who I am, I will not say I am the woman with the plastic plate. I will tell you I am the woman who served herself on silver, even when the world insisted I no longer deserved it. The betrayal did not come like a sudden storm that breaks windows and rattles rooftops. It came like a small draft under a door, something you don't notice at first, but that chills you slowly until your bones ache. And that draft was the moment I realized the plastic plate was not an accident or joke, but a statement, a decision made about me without me. And once that truth settled inside me, it spread like a shadow, touching every corner of the room. It happened on an afternoon when the sun was pouring through the large glass windows of the dining hall, the kind of bright, sterile light that makes everything look cleaner but also more artificial, and I was sitting at the long table surrounded by the family who still called me mother and grandmother, but who treated me more like a child they were burdened to watch. The food had been set out in containers that my daughter insisted were easier, less trouble, and the staff of the complex hovered nearby ready to step in if anyone spilled, as if the possibility of a stain was the greatest tragedy that could occur. I had reached for one of the ceramic plates stacked on the table because it was natural, because that was what adults did when they wanted to serve themselves. And that was when my daughter's hand intercepted mine, pressing down lightly, smiling, that smile she saves for when she knows she is in charge, the one that never quite reaches her eyes. "Here, Mom," she said in that soft sing-song tone that is meant to sound affectionate but always comes across as condescension. "This one is better for you, lighter, no risk of accidents." and she placed the plastic plate into my hands. For a moment I froze. Not because of the plate itself, but because of the echo I heard behind her words. The echo of a truth I had been avoiding, the truth that she no longer trusted me to hold even the weight of a plate. Around us, someone laughed. It might have been my son-in-law, or one of the older grandchildren. I cannot be sure now, but the sound of that laugh made it clear that the moment had been noticed, and not only noticed, but approved, as if I had just been placed in a category where I no longer had dignity, but instead entertainment value. I wanted to speak, to say something sharp and cutting the way I once could when I felt insulted, but the words would not form, not because I lacked them, but because I knew instinctively that no one at that table would have heard me. They would have nodded, smiled indulgently, and then ignored the weight of my protest just as easily as they had ignored my reach for the real plate. So I held the plastic one, and in that holding I understood something that I had been avoiding for months, perhaps years, that they were beginning to prepare for my disappearance while I was still alive. They were practicing the art of treating me as though I were already gone, already incapable, already erased, and the plastic was simply the first token of that rehearsal. The betrayal was not the plate itself. It was the silent agreement among them that it was acceptable, even right, to reduce me, and that agreement hurt more than any insult could. I could see it in the way my daughter's eyes darted quickly to the others, checking their faces, confirming that they approved of her gesture, and I could see it in the way no one questioned her. My son-in-law reached for another glass of wine. The grandchildren buried their eyes in their screens, and the staff smiled politely as if this were the natural order of things. In that room, I was not a woman with decades of a life behind me. I was a fragile inconvenience who needed managing. Later that day, when the gathering was over and everyone left with their coats and their chatter, leaving behind crumbs and wrappers and the faint scent of store-bought icing, I walked slowly back to my room. I did not let them see how deliberate each step felt, how heavy my chest was with unshed words. When I closed the door behind me, I leaned against it for a moment, the quiet pressing into me, and I let myself feel the sharpness of what had just happened. I remembered my wedding day, when my husband and I had unwrapped the box of silver cutlery gifted to us by his parents, heavy forks and spoons that glinted with the promise of adulthood, of having our own table, our own meals, our own place in the world. That silver had been with me through every stage of life, polished for Christmases, dulled from everyday use, shining again for anniversaries. And now, in this place, they had hidden it away, stored it somewhere, or perhaps even given it away without telling me, because they thought plastic was all I needed. The betrayal was not just in the moment, but in what it revealed about every choice they had made for me. My daughter chose this complex not because I asked for it, but because it made her life easier, because she wanted to know I was monitored without having to be the one who monitored me. She spoke about safety, about convenience, about activities and companionship, but what she really meant was that it allowed her to live freely without guilt. I could see it now, all of it. The pattern of decisions made in rooms I was not invited into, discussions about my future where my name was used but my voice was absent. The betrayal was not a single act, but a culmination of small erasures, and the plate was simply the object that made the truth visible. I sat on the edge of my bed that evening, the plastic plate discarded on the counter, and I thought about all the times I'd accepted quietly, all the moments I had smiled and nodded to avoid conflict. I thought about the times they had told me not to worry, that they would take care of everything, and I had allowed them because I wanted to believe it was love. But love does not reduce a person to plastic. Love does not erase history with the excuse of convenience. Love does not laugh when dignity is stripped away. In that realization, the betrayal landed fully in me, not just as anger but as a kind of grief. The grief of knowing that my own family no longer saw me as the woman I had been, but only as the shell they could manage and contain. That night I could not sleep. I turned over in bed, listening to the hum of the air vent, the occasional distant sound of a television left on too loud, and I thought of the silver spoon I had hidden, the one piece I had refused to let go of. I rose quietly, opened the drawer, and held it in my hand. Its weight was small but real, and it felt more honest than anything I had touched that day. I took a piece of fruit from the small bowl near my window, peeled it slowly, and ate with that spoon. Not because it was necessary, but because it reminded me of who I was. And as I ate, I felt the betrayal harden into something else, something that would not let me go back to the comfort of denial. They had given me plastic, but I still held silver, and that meant something. It meant the story was not finished, no matter how much they wanted to write the ending for me. After that day with the plastic plate, I began to notice the small ways in which my world was shrinking, not through sudden cruelty or outright rejection, but through a steady sequence of quiet diminishments, gestures so subtle they might have seemed harmless if taken alone, but which together formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored, a pattern that said I was no longer trusted to move freely in the world I had built for myself, that my choices were now subject to review and my preferences treated as inconveniences. It began with meals, because food is always the first territory of control, and in the dining hall they started placing me at a table with others they thought were like me, though the truth is I was not like them. Many of them were slipping into confusion or repeating the same questions over and over. But because I had gray hair and shaky hands, I was seated there too, as though memory loss were contagious, and no one asked me whether I wanted to sit somewhere else. They simply guided me with gentle smiles and firm arms, and I complied because what was the alternative? To protest and draw the label of difficult, to resist and have them whisper later that perhaps I needed more care than I admitted. The meals themselves were bland and predictable, food designed for efficiency, not for pleasure, and when I asked once whether we might have something spiced differently, something with garlic or cumin or a little heat, the staff member smiled in that polite professional way and said it might upset sensitive stomachs, which meant that the lowest common denominator of tolerance decided what everyone would eat, and so the table became a place where I chewed dutifully but without joy. And I remembered the kitchen I had once ruled, the way the air would fill with steam and fragrance when I cooked for family gatherings, the laughter that used to rise from my dining room, and I felt the contrast like a stone pressing against my ribs. It was not only food, it was sound too, because in the evenings I liked to watch the news, not for pleasure, but because I wanted to remain aware of the world beyond these walls. Yet whenever I turned on the television in the lounge, the younger staff would quickly change the channel to something lighter, a nature documentary or a singing competition, telling me I didn't need to worry myself with politics, that I should relax and enjoy myself, as though my mind were a fragile vase that might crack under the weight of headlines, and each time I swallowed the protest that rose in me, but I stored the bitterness quietly, because it is not only the denial of choice that hurts, it is the implication that your capacity to care is gone, that your opinions no longer matter, that being old means being shielded rather than engaged. Then came the redecorating of my room, a gesture presented as a kindness by my daughter, who arrived one afternoon with bags of pastel throws, soft floral prints, and little framed motivational sayings she placed on the dresser as though I were a schoolgirl in a dormitory who needed reminders to smile, and she removed the darker, heavier fabrics I had chosen, fabrics that reminded me of my mother's home, of winters by the fire, of evenings reading novels that did not flinch from sorrow. When I asked where my old blanket had gone, she said she donated it, her voice light but firm, because she thought I deserved something cheerful, and that word cheerful struck me as a dismissal, as though sorrow had no place in an old woman's room, as though dignity were the same as decoration. Slowly I realized that friends had stopped visiting, not because they did not care, but because the distance was too much, because parking was complicated, because life has a way of sweeping people in its current, and so the afternoons that had once been punctuated by phone calls or familiar knocks on my door grew quiet, the silence broken only by the shuffle of residents in the hallway or the occasional cart rattling with meals. I sat sometimes by the window watching the cars move in and out of the lot, and I thought of the years when my house was the meeting place, the house everyone came to because there would always be coffee brewing, and the absence of that traffic in my life was a wound that deepened each day. Even within the family, the distance was growing, because my daughter, who once called to tell me small details of her life, now spoke to me as though I were a client to be managed, her voice efficient, updates brief, always ending with a reminder to take my pills or to be careful not to strain myself, as if the only conversations worth having with me were those that monitored my compliance. The grandchildren drifted further too, offering quick hellos when they visited, though more often their eyes stayed fixed on their screens, and I became a background presence in their lives, someone to hug quickly for a photograph before returning to whatever digital world claimed them. The slow withdrawal of genuine contact was not marked by a single dramatic moment, but by the accumulation of glances not given, of words not asked, of silences that grew longer each time. The staff, too, though never unkind, began speaking to me differently, using that tone of exaggerated patience reserved for children or for those who are lost, stretching words as if I needed extra time to process them, when in fact my mind was still, clear and sharp, and each time they said, "That's right, good job," after I remembered some trivial detail I wanted to scream, because they were mistaking the tremor in my hand for a tremor in my mind. I was being rewritten in their eyes, and no protest could undo the ink once it dried. Perhaps the cruelest diminishment was the way my time was no longer mine. In the home where I had lived before, even if my body slowed, the hours still belonged to me. I could choose to wake early or late, to sit quietly with coffee, or to busy myself with tasks. But here the schedule was set, meals at the same time, activities announced by flyers, lights dimmed in the corridors at 9 as though the building itself were nudging us toward bed, and though no one locked me in, the effect was the same, because when the world around you moves to a rhythm, you did not choose. Your own rhythm weakens until you feel like a passenger in a train you never boarded willingly. Each of these small acts might sound harmless to someone outside, someone who thinks of care only as safety, but to live inside it is to feel a daily erosion, a weathering away of the self, and I began to feel as though I were disappearing, not in a sudden vanishing, but in the slow fading of a photograph left too long in the sun. I was still visible, but less sharply, less distinctly, until one day perhaps no one would remember what my features had been. That was the first escalation. Not a storm, not a battle, but the quiet, steady pressure of a world that insisted I was less than I knew myself to be. And though I swallowed my protests, inside me something was beginning to resist. A seed of refusal, growing in the soil of humiliation. I did not know then what it would become, but I knew I could not let the fading continue without leaving some trace of myself behind. The change did not come with a dramatic announcement or some grand gesture witnessed by others. It arrived quietly one evening, when I opened the bottom drawer of the dresser, where my daughter had hastily stuffed the last of my belongings, a jumble of scarves and old recipe cards and photographs she did not think worth framing, and beneath it all, wrapped in a faded napkin, I found what she had not bothered to notice, the roll of silver cutlery from my wedding set, tarnished from years without, polished but still heavy with memory. My fingers trembled as I unwrapped it, not only because of age, but because of what it meant to hold something that was truly mine, something that had not been chosen for me or decided on my behalf, something that carried the echo of evenings where I was the hostess, not the dependent. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding one fork as though it were a relic, and in that moment I realized that while they could reduce the size of my room, manage my schedule, and replace my blanket, they could not erase the weight of my own history. And if I was to remain visible to myself, I would have to create rituals that reminded me daily of who I was. That night, I set the little table by the window, not with the plastic cup and thin plate that came standard in this place, but with the real fork and a napkin folded the way I used to do when guests came. And though my dinner was nothing more than reheated stew from the communal kitchen, I ate it as though it were a feast, chewing slowly, tasting carefully, letting the silver press against my lips like a benediction. No one else saw, no one else cared, but to me it was proof that I could still choose dignity, even if it was only in the small privacy of my own room. I began to dress for these dinners, not extravagantly but deliberately, putting on the brooch I had inherited from my mother, brushing my hair, even applying a touch of lipstick, because it reminded me that life had not yet reduced me to function, alone. Each evening became a ceremony, a reclaiming, and though the food did not change, the taste was different because I had chosen the manner of eating it. In those quiet meals, I began to think about more than survival. I began to think about legacy, about how I wanted to spend what time remained, not simply waiting to be managed, but insisting on being remembered as someone who gave, created, and shared. I remembered the recipes I had written by hand decades ago, the ones stained with oil and flour, and I imagined what it might mean to cook again, not only for myself but for others here, to remind them that life was not meant to be swallowed blandly, but savored, even in old age. So I wrote a letter, carefully in my neatest script, addressed to the board of the residence, suggesting that I could host a small cooking class for those who wanted to learn or remember the joy of preparing food. I called it Old Hands in the Kitchen, and I enclosed 3 recipes, simple but rich, dishes that had fed generations in my family. I sealed the letter, gave it to the receptionist, and waited. Days passed without reply. I asked once at the desk, and the young woman said cheerfully that my suggestion was under review, her voice the kind that means forgotten, and I felt the sting of dismissal again. But this time, I did not let it end there. I wrote another letter, sharper in tone, reminding them that old age does not erase skill and that contribution is not the same as risk. And I sent it again, this time hand-delivered to the manager. My daughter would have scolded me if she had known, told me I was embarrassing myself, told me it was too much trouble. But she was not the one who had to live here every day surrounded by the dull hum of resignation, and I knew that if I did not push, no one would. The refusal to be silent began to spread into other parts of my life. I started taking longer walks in the garden behind the building, not at the scheduled times but whenever I pleased, ignoring the gentle reminders of staff that the path was slippery or that I should not overexert myself because I wanted my body to remember that it still belonged to me. I carried the silver spoon in my coat pocket as a talisman, touching it when I felt myself being spoken down to, a reminder that I was more than their assumptions. I began to speak more boldly at meals, asking questions about the news, challenging the bland conversation, insisting on being present as a mind, not just a body. And though some looked at me with surprise, a few smiled with recognition as though they, too, had been waiting for someone to disrupt the monotony. The shift was not loud. It did not overturn the structure of my days, but it altered the way I inhabited them. I was no longer only enduring. I was shaping, even in small ways, and each act of resistance, setting the table, writing a letter, walking at my own pace, was a declaration that I had not been erased. And though I knew challenges would come, though I knew my daughter would resist my insistence on autonomy, I also knew that something had awakened in me that would not be silenced again. The midpoint of my story was not marked by escape or confrontation, but by the quiet decision to act as though I still mattered, and in that decision, I began to feel alive again. They did not answer my letters with words at first. They answered with procedures, which is how institutions say no without the unpleasantness of admitting it, And it started with a laminated notice slipped under my door announcing a care plan, review for the following Tuesday. The kind of meeting that sounds helpful until you realize you are the topic, not the participant. And when I walked into the little office with the beige chairs and the ficus that had never known real rain, my daughter was already there with a folder on her lap, and that look she wears when she is about to do something she calls responsible. The manager smiled with professional warmth, and the nurse practitioner arranged a clipboard as if it were a tray, and they spoke about goals and safety and liability, and how the community kitchen could not be used by residents because of insurance, and how requests that involve heat sources would require additional assessment, and how my enthusiasm for teaching others to cook was admirable, but perhaps unrealistic given the demographic and the staffing ratios. And then, as if to soften the blow, my daughter placed her hand over mine and said she had been thinking about the next step for me. Maybe not now, but soon, a quieter wing with more support, a place where I would not have to worry about anything. And she said this with a compassion so polished I could see my reflection in it. A tired old woman in a chair, and I realized with a clarity that felt like a clean cut that the letters had climbed the wrong staircase, that they had arrived at the floor where decisions are made and been filed under risks. And I felt a pulse of anger in my throat, not because I was surprised, but because I had asked to give and they heard only that I might take. I kept my voice calm, because at my age the tone is always on trial, and I told them I wanted 1 hour a week in the staff kitchen under supervision, that I would bring my own ingredients and scrub the counters and leave the room cleaner than I found it, that I would sign any form their lawyers devised, and the manager pursed her lips and said it would set a precedent, and the nurse asked me if I ever forgot to turn off the stove in my previous home, and my daughter chimed in with the memory of the winter fall and the burned kettle, and I watched the story congeal in front of me, the single spill becoming a habit, the single mistake becoming a portrait, and I understood they were not truly evaluating my request. They were rehearsing a script in which my agency was an anecdote that would fade at the end of a paragraph. After the meeting, my daughter walked me back to my room as if I were the one who lived at the edges of maps, telling me she had spoken to the bank and that it would be simpler if my allowance were deposited onto a card she could monitor, not because she doubted me, she said, but because budgeting is stressful, and she wanted to spare me that weight. She looked around the room, appraised the comforter she had chosen, the tidy stack of pastel throws, and then, as if remembering something important, she opened my dresser drawers with a haste that had nothing to do with love, her mouth tightening when she found only scarves and recipe cards, and I watched her with the stillness of a deep lake while my hand remained in my coat pocket, curled. Around the cold oval of the silver spoon I had slipped there before the meeting, the old habit of women everywhere who learn to hide what cannot be replaced, and when she asked lightly if I had come across any old kitchen odds and ends, I smiled and said only that I was traveling light now, and she nodded, suspicion diluted by the comfort of her own narrative. That evening, a paper wristband appeared on my nightstand, mint green and stamped fall risk in cheerful sans serif. A gift from the nurse, she said, optional for now, but recommended, and I held it for a long moment feeling the ordinary softness of it, and the way ordinary things can still abrade, and then I placed it in the drawer under my brooch as if it were a ticket to a show I had decided not to attend. When I went to dinner, they had moved my place card to the end of the memory table again, and when I asked why, someone said it was closer to the staff station, which made me laugh, not loudly, just enough to remind myself that laughter can sound like a blade. The week unspooled with the peculiar speed of late life, days both long and short, mornings that dissolved into evenings like sugar in tea, and in that flow small frictions multiplied, the kettle in my room replaced with an auto shut-off unit that wheezed and scolded and whooshed off before the water reached a true boil. My spice tin confiscated because open containers of strong odors were not considerate of neighbors, a poster pinned near the elevator about new dignity protocols that translated to more eyes and fewer permissions. And yet in the middle of this careful shrinking, there were glints that caught and held, because the universe is mischievous, and sometimes it hands you a person exactly when you have stopped believing you will meet another ally, and mine arrived as a young evening aide whose name tag said Awa, a woman with a soft French accent and wrists quick as birds, who watched me the way people watch a storm ray at the surface when it has chosen to show itself. And one night when she brought my medication, I asked her, with the formality of one conspirator addressing another in an old novel, whether she could help me peel onions in a place where the doors opened, and she smiled without teeth, and said she would bring her own knife, a small one, good steel. Nothing dangerous if you respect it. And that was how the plan became more than anger. It became logistics, which is the true name of courage in the lives of women who have no armies. We met the first time in the little staff kitchenette at 9:10, because that is when the corridors empty and the televisions begin to murmur to themselves. And I brought butter wrapped in paper and a single onion hidden in my pocket like contraband fruit, and she brought cumin in a twist of foil and a pan. She swore no one loved, and together we made nothing more remarkable than a quick pot of lentils. But when the butter melted and the cumin woke, and the onion turned translucent, the air changed. It grew human. It remembered kitchens where arguments and reconciliations had risen and fallen in the same hour, and the sound drew people the way a song draws small birds. Mr. Dalton from the third floor planting himself carefully in a chair by the door with the stoicism of an old oak, Mrs. Green with her slippered shuffle. Two others I did not yet know who stood with their hands to their throats, like parishioners on a threshold. And I asked them to wait, and they did, quiet as waiting rooms before a good birth. And when the lentils softened, I ladled spoonfuls into cups and watched as their mouths recognized something their tongues had been missing. Not fancy food, but the kind that respects time. We were caught, of course, not by malice, but by the heaviness of routine. The night supervisor appearing in the doorway with the look of a woman who has been taught to fear deviation, her voice gentle but firm, reminders about policy and precedent, and the slipperiness of heat, and I apologized with an elegance she did not expect, and Awa took responsibility in a way that made me want to adopt her, as if women could adopt each other, and erase the mothers who had failed to understand them, and in the morning an incident report awaited my signature. The manager kind enough to call it a misunderstanding, the sort of kindness that is a leash, and I signed my name with the long curve my husband always said looked musical, because in that room I could do nothing else. What I could do was build a harbor out of small stones, so I began to write again, not letters this time but lists, menus scrawled on the back of flyer paper, shopping sequences that considered weight and carry distance, conversion charts because the new measuring cups confused my hand. And in the late mornings, I visited the tiny market 3 blocks away where the tomatoes were bruised but honest, and the butcher called everyone ma'am without irony, and I bought what I could hide, sardines and parsley and a lemon so bright it made my fingers smell like July, and I carried them home in a canvas bag that said, "Choose joy" in a font I resented but tolerated, and I tucked them behind the bland yogurt cups in the communal fridge, behind the sane stacks of things that taste like being spared rather than being fed. And each hiding place felt like an aria hummed into my own ear. The pressure tightened in response, as pressure always does when it meets a woman who refuses to go limp, a voicemail from my daughter describing a new evaluation with a neuropsychologist, because it would help our case with the board. A polite call from a social worker who used the phrase sense of proportion as though it were shampoo. A pamphlet slipped under my door about the benefits of reminiscence therapy, with photographs of smiling women folding napkins cut to look like roses. And then, insolently, a box of plastic cutlery left on my dresser with a note that said, "For convenience during visits, don't strain yourself," with a heart drawn next to it, the kind of heart that looks like a fence. and although I felt a heat in my chest, that might have tasted like rage if I had breathed too deeply, I wrapped the box in a towel and set it next to the wastebasket with a precision that made me feel like a surgeon. When my daughter arrived that Sunday and found the box gone, she asked about it with a lightness that was not light, and when I told her I had given it to someone who needed it more, she paused, recalculated, then took a breath and said we should stop by the bank on Wednesday to finalize the card. And I said I would rather not, and she said that made things complicated, and I said that sometimes complication is simply a synonym for freedom, and she blinked at my tone the way a person blinks when the light changes from decorative to honest. They tested me, because this is the ritual of doubt in old age. And a woman with a pleasant blouse wrote my name on a form and asked me to draw a clock, and to remember 3 words, and to subtract 7 from 100 until it felt like penance. And I played their game with a boredom that must have looked like difficulty. But when she asked me to define the word season, I told her, it is what you sprinkle on food when you refuse to eat what you are given without insisting on taste. And she did not. Write that down. At the end, she smiled kindly and said the results were not concerning, but not definitive, which is the bureaucratic way of saying useful, because ambiguity is currency when families negotiate control. And I left with the silver, spoon heavier in my pocket, and the strange comfort of having remained unsimplified. I saw my daughter in the corridor afterwards speaking to the manager with the posture of a woman who thinks she is saving a life one permission at a time. And when she turned toward me, her face softened into the public mother, the one who assures and soothes, and she told me she had arranged a meeting with an elder law attorney just to get our paperwork in order. And I thought of the dozens of papers I had ordered in my life, the school forms, the mortgage, the contracts, the wills, and how on each of them my name had meant something solid, and I told her I would not sign anything that transferred my choices to someone who laughed at my plate. And the silence after that sentence felt like a bridge that had been crossed without witnesses. That night, Awa found me in the hallway, pretending to admire the painting of sunflowers that had never known sun, and she slipped me a tiny jar of harissa, so red it looked like a dare, and she said softly that her aunt used to keep such a jar beside the sugar bowl because some mornings require heat to remember the mouth is alive. And I wanted to cry, but I have learned that tears in public are deposited into ledgers I do not control. So I thanked her with the kind of gratitude that moves like weather. It is a peculiar thing to feel pressure and clarity grow together, to feel the hand tighten at your elbow while the path straightens under your feet. And in those days, everything I did began to feel like rehearsal, not for surrender, but for an opening night no one had scheduled. My lists becoming menus, my menus becoming invitations folded into the corners of conversations. A whisper to Mr. Dalton about candles because electricity is generous but flame is honest. A question to Mrs. Green about whether she still had her wedding serving spoon tucked somewhere under the socks, because certain metals remember parties and behave accordingly. A borrowed tablecloth from the activities closet that smelled like old starch and community. A test run of lemonade with real lemons in the art room, where the sink was deep and expressive. A note on my bedside paper that read, Friday after bingo, if the corridor is quiet. And each of these small acts stacked like plates into a tower that would not topple because hunger was its center of gravity. The second escalation was not a fight staged for cameras. It was the long, damp pressure that makes stone learn the shape of water, the calls and forms and kindly threats, the reassignment of my seat, the confiscation of taste, and through it all the steady pulse of something inside me that refused to agree to an ending written by someone else. A pulse that spoke in recipes and in the clink of silver against ceramic and in the thud of a lemon on a counter. And by the time Friday arrived, the Friday after bingo, the Friday when the corridor might, by mercy, be quiet. I had rolled my silver in its napkin, hidden the candles in the hollow of a cardigan, counted the plates twice, and told myself that the worst that could happen was a reprimand, And the best was that someone would taste and remember that they were still a person with a tongue and a past. I stood at my window as dusk softened the parking lot into an unconvincing watercolor. I watched the first lit rectangles of other people's rooms bloom like little theaters. I touched the spoon in my pocket as if it had a heartbeat of its own, and I understood that I had come to the place in the story where the past returns not to drag me backward, but to hand me a ladle, and where the pressure no longer pushed me down but pressed me into shape. The climax came not in the form of shouting or plates shattered against a wall, but in the quiet, deliberate lines of ink pressed onto paper. Because at my age, you learn that words, written carefully and signed with a steady hand, can cut deeper and last longer than any outburst. I had endured their performance of concern, the lawyer with his polished shoes and his careful tone, the article that painted me as fragile and vanished, the letters dripping with accusation disguised as worry, and I realized that if I did not end the story myself, they would keep rewriting me into a character I no longer recognized, a vulnerable ghost hovering around the edges of their lives. So I sat at the small desk in Joyce's house, the one with the crooked drawer that stuck unless you tugged it sharply, and I pulled out thick stationery I had bought at the pharmacy. Nothing fancy but heavier than the flimsy paper of bills and notices, and I wrote 2 letters, one to Lisa, one to the lawyer. The first was short, almost blunt, a refusal disguised as courtesy. I know what you did. I know what you didn't say. I am not angry. I am not coming back. Take care of your own life now, because I have finally started mine. The second was colder, official, the kind of language that belongs in files. To whom it may concern, I am of sound mind in a safe environment and not under duress. I have retained local legal counsel. Any further attempts to contact me under the guise of concern will be considered harassment. I signed it Martha Harlow in a hand that did not waver, folded it, sealed it, and when I dropped both envelopes into the blue post box on the corner, the clang of metal was louder than thunder. I walked back slowly under a gray sky that smelled faintly of rain. My coat pulled close, my pockets heavy, not with fear but with certainty, and when I stepped into the warm kitchen, Joyce looked up from her crossword and studied my face the way women study weather, and she said nothing, just poured me tea because she could see I had done something irreversible. For the first time in decades, I was not waiting for permission, not asking for understanding, not hoping for reconciliation. I was declaring an ending. There was no triumphal music, no applause, only the steady hum of the kettle and the smell of garlic Joyce had been chopping. But I felt taller in my chair, straighter in my spine, as though a weight had slid off me that I had carried so long I forgot it was not part of my body. And after the letters, after the final refusal, came the strange quiet that follows decisive acts. The phone buzzed with new messages, the mailbox filled with envelopes bearing familiar handwriting, but I did not answer. I did not open. I had cut the cord, and the silence that followed was not emptiness, but space. Space for my own life to unfold. Into that space came Arthur, steady as always, sitting in his corner booth, asking for cream with 2 splashes and telling me about birds. And I found myself listening, not with the distracted half-attention of someone bracing for intrusion, but with the openness of someone who has room again for simple things. Into that space came Kieran's voice on the phone, warm and hesitant, not demanding but offering, and I allowed it, because his love had never been conditional, never laced with control. And into that space came laughter with Joyce over burnt toast, the rustle of Franklin the cat climbing into my lap, the ache of my feet after a long shift that felt more honest than any pampered day of being managed. The climax was not an explosion. It was a cut, clean and final, the kind of cut that frees a balloon to rise or a ship to sail. I had mailed away the last traces of their control, and in doing so, I had claimed something larger than defiance. I had claimed my own narrative. For years I had been the woman with the plastic plate, the guest at her own table, the leftover at the airport lounge, the shadow in someone else's house, but no longer. Now I was the woman who wrote the final letter, who chose not to return, who built a life from scratch, not because she was abandoned, but because she was released. And when I lay down that night, the window cracked open to let in the cool smell of rain, I felt a peace that did not ask for approval. I was not waiting to be found. I had already found myself. The days after the letters settled into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like living, a rhythm I had not realized I still knew how to hear. The mornings began with the scrape of a chair on Joyce's kitchen floor and the slow bloom of light across the counter where we spread our modest breakfast. And in that light, I no longer felt like an object waiting to be handled, but like a woman sitting at her own table. And even though it was borrowed, even though the plates were mismatched, and the cat always pawed at the edge of the bread, the act of choosing how to eat, what to drink, when to linger, was a freedom so complete it made me laugh softly into my cup. It surprised me that laughter could return without bitterness, not the sharp laugh I had cultivated in defense, but the low, warm sound that comes when you forget you are being observed. And I realized then that I had not lost myself completely. I had only been hidden under years of other people's decisions, and now I was brushing away the dust. Kieran came on Sundays, walking slower than when he was a boy, but with the same eagerness in his eyes, and he asked me not what I needed, but what I wanted, and the difference in that question filled the room like fresh air after a storm. Sometimes we went to the park and sat on benches where children shouted in the distance. Sometimes we simply stayed at Joyce's table drinking tea, and once he asked me if I regretted cutting ties with Lisa. I thought carefully before answering, because regret is a heavy word, and I no longer wanted to carry what did not belong to me. I told him I regretted only that she could not see me as I truly am, that she clung so fiercely to the picture of a weak old woman that she missed the reality of her mother still alive before her, but that I did not regret saving myself. And he nodded with a solemnity I recognized from his father, the kind of listening that does not argue but accepts. And in his silence I felt permission not from him, but from myself to keep walking the path I had chosen. Evenings became rituals of silver again, not hidden now but displayed, the fork and spoon placed deliberately on the table, even if the meal was nothing more than soup and bread, because it was not about the food, but about the ceremony of reminding myself that I was still entitled to dignity. And sometimes Joyce joined me, sometimes I ate alone, but always I lit a candle, even if only for a few minutes, and in the flicker I felt all the women who had come before me, my mother, my grandmother, their hands also diminished in their time, their choices clipped, their desires dismissed, and I whispered to them that I had remembered us, that I had not surrendered completely. Letters from Lisa kept coming at first, full of apologies that did not sound like apologies, phrases such as, "I only wanted what was best for you," or "You misunderstood my intentions." And I left them unopened on the shelf until one day I gathered them into a bundle and placed them in the drawer beneath the spoon, not as keepsakes, but as proof of what I had refused. Because sometimes survival is measured not only by what you embrace, but by what you decline to touch. The phone rang less often after that, and eventually the silence deepened, but it no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like space I had chosen, a clearing in which to build something new. One evening, after Joyce had gone to bed and the cat had curled against my legs, I wrote a letter, not to them but to myself, a letter I sealed and tucked into my book of recipes, addressed simply, "To the woman who comes after me." I wrote that life will try to serve you on plastic. It will hand you things designed to make you smaller, to make you manageable, and people you love will tell you it is for your own good. But you must remember that dignity is not in the objects they hand you, but in the choices you dare to make, And if your hands tremble when you lift the silver, then let them tremble proudly, because trembling hands can still carry weight. I ended the letter with a promise that I would not let myself vanish quietly, that I would continue to set the table as though I deserved it, because I do. Now when I sit at the window in the evenings and watch the last light sink behind the houses, I no longer think of myself as waiting. I think of myself as living, and I feel a calmness that is not resignation but a hard-won peace. If another woman my age were to sit beside me and whisper that she feels invisible, I would place the spoon in her palm and tell her it has always been heavier than plastic, and so is she. And perhaps that is the closest I can come to resolution. Not a triumphant ending, but a steady truth. I was given plastic, I chose silver, and in that choice I became myself again.